My name is Lindsay McLaren. My name is Lindsay McLaren. I'm a member of this working group, and I'll be sharing the moderating role today with our group's co-chair, David Somekh, whom you'll hear from shortly. I want to extend a huge thank you to the other working group members, including Amira Patel, co-chair of the Health and Wellbeing Working Group, who is working behind the scenes today to help everything run smoothly. So I'll briefly situate our session today within the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and movement more broadly. So as most on this call will likely know, a well-being economy is an economy designed to serve people and the planet, not the other way around. Rather than treating economic growth as an end in and of itself and pursuing it at all costs, which leads to significant harms, including to health, a well-being economy puts our human and planetary needs at the center of its activities, ensuring that these needs are all equally met by default. A well-being economy is fundamentally grounded in certain principles, including the 4 Ps shown here of pre-distribution, or ensuring from the outset that everyone has the power and resources needed to thrive. Purpose, referring to the economy's central purpose to deliver human and ecological well-being. Prevention, meaning that rather than always fixing the harm we do to people and the environment after the fact, designing an economy so that the harm doesn't happen in the first place. And finally, people-powered, where economic decisions are made through direct involvement of all people in decision-making and agenda setting. And as I hope will become clear today, it's not a stretch at all to connect these principles to health. So just a few words about the Health and Wellbeing Economy Working Group. The working group was formed approximately last summer, and we identified a couple of core questions to anchor our work. These include, what are the biggest challenges to health in the current economic system? And what would an economic system that supported health look like? You'll start to hear some answers to these questions today, and we're excited to launch the working group's efforts today with this webinar, which we intend to be the first of a series. So with that, I'll hand it over to David Somekh for some introductory remarks.
Yes, thanks a lot, Lindsay. Yes, really, all I want to say at this point is it's great to see people signing on. We're very pleased that you're willing to give time to listen to what we have to say. As Lindsay framed it, this is the first, we hope, of a series. We hope to put on the next webinar in a couple of months. What we started with is the sort of most negative thing really is why the present economic model is a bad thing as far as health is concerned. What we want to go on to do then is being much more positive and look at potential solutions, because that's really a very challenging issue, but one that's really, we think, is incredibly important to try and explore. So just to mention my co-conspirators, they'll introduce themselves properly, but essentially Lindsay, who kicked off, works at the University of Calgary. Tony Holohan, formerly Chief Medical Officer in Ireland, but now works at the University College Dublin. Anne-Marie Cunningham is a working GP in Northern Ireland. I'm a retired psychiatrist, but working in the not-for-profit sector, running a charity basically, and Kathrin Lauber works at the University of Edinburgh. So as you see, what we're aiming to do is try and keep to time, all of us. It's also challenging, but we'll spend about 8 to 10 minutes each making a presentation, and then we'll have a panel discussion, really sharing our thoughts about what we've been talking about and responses to each other's presentations. But we're watching closely for comments in the chat, and then Lindsay and I will try and get into a conversation, or at least take up the points that people who've been attending and have wanted to make points, really to give some airing for them, and then maybe 5 or 10 minutes at the end, just kind of summarizing what we think we've heard and what it implies. So that's me. So back to Lindsay for a more detailed scene setting.
Great, thank you, David. Okay, so I have the privilege of making a few opening remarks today. So my name is Lindsay McLaren. I am a professor at the University of Calgary in Canada, where my research and teaching focus on social determinants and political economy of health. I am also a research associate at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And I'm joining you today from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis District of Alberta, Métis Nation of Alberta Districts 5 and 6. So I will just offer a few remarks about what do we mean by health in a well-being economy. So I think it's important to begin by acknowledging that the word health has some baggage. And I just invite you to reflect on what comes to mind when you hear the word health. That word tends to lead people to instantly think of certain things like medical care and hospitals, physical injury and physical illness and injury, or maybe behaviors that we tend to view as chosen by individuals, like choosing to eat nutritious foods or not to smoke. Health in a well-being economy requires going far beyond this very, very dominant, but ultimately very narrow way of thinking. And in this space, we're excited to invite you to join us in expanding our collective thinking and imagination about health. So to do this, there are a few key considerations that I'll use to anchor my remarks here today. So first is, what do we mean by health? Second is the importance of asking the question, who gets sick in the first place and why? So some of you will recognize this as the key issue of health equity. And third is to connect the answers to these first two to our current economic system, including dominant narratives, such as those noted on the previous slide, which serve to distract from the economic system shift that's needed to support health. Drawing connections to the economy is, of course, a crucial step in starting to envision an alternative, which is, of course, what our group and we all in general are all about. So what do we mean by health? I don't anticipate too much resistance to the idea that health is multifaceted and not just about sickness or its absence, although we very often treat it that way. Rather, it includes physical, mental, and social dimensions. I think this is a useful place to start because it highlights that health is well-being. And I'll say that again, health is well-being. So when we talk about health in a well-being economy, it's actually redundant in a sense. The things we would do to create an economy where everyone has what they need to thrive is a healthy society. This makes our working group task a bit messy, admittedly, but it's important for grounding our thinking. Now, although this way of thinking about health is not new, it seems to take on renewed relevance right now, where our experiences of feeling well or unwell are linked for many of us to some of the immense challenges that we're facing around things that we may feel no control or agency, like financial insecurity and the material implications that has on our lives, anxiety and grief about the climate emergency, etc. And so, at the risk of stating the obvious, we do not currently have a healthy society. Grounded in a holistic definition of health, a next step in this space of health in a well-being economy is to accept that healthcare has hard limits in terms of health, without taking away from the necessity of high quality, universal public healthcare. Healthcare itself has little to do with who gets sick in the first place. This was made very clear during the COVID-19 pandemic, where, in contrast to the sentiment that we're all in it together, the risk of getting sick and dying was not at all equal or arbitrary. It was and continues to be heavily influenced by things like living and working conditions, which themselves are far from equally or fairly distributed. In Canada, for example, as well as elsewhere, the pandemic disproportionately affected those occupying what quickly came to be seen as essential jobs, which lacked basic job protections like paid sick leave. It also disproportionately affected those living in for-profit care homes, which itself provides a hint of the connection to the economy. The question of who gets sick in the first place and why draws attention to what some of you will well know as the social determinants of health and the upstream metaphor, where rather than constantly pulling drowning people out of the water downstream, we provide the conditions upstream to avoid falling into the river in the first place. These are not the domain of healthcare, but of social and economic conditions and policy more broadly. Decoupling health from healthcare has proven to be exceedingly difficult, but it's essential to a vision of health in a well-being economy where upstream determinants need to occupy a much larger space. Recognizing the role of living and working conditions in shaping health is one thing, but to engage with the well-being economy, we need to even go a step further and ask what or who shapes those living conditions and working conditions in the first place, so that they are, for some people, so harmful for health. A key insight here is to recognize and indeed embrace the fact that the unequal distribution of the social determinants of health is not natural or arbitrary, but rather, as powerfully conveyed in this important work by the World Health Organization Commission on the Social Determinants of Health, the result of a toxic combination of poor social policies and programs, unfair economic arrangements, and bad politics. So from there, we arrive at the economy and the massive but largely hidden ways in which it influences health. So let's first just remember that the economy is nothing more or less than how we as a society organize ourselves to produce and distribute the things we need to be well, and who decides. We happen to exist in an economic system that, through its imperative of private profit and its premise in competition, is perfectly constructed to erode social and ecological determinants of health, and in fact is fundamentally incompatible with health equity. So I'll just offer a few examples. The policy playbook under neoliberal capitalism includes intentional erosion of public services through budget cuts and privatization, which serve to reduce access to high quality and affordable public education, healthcare, recreation, etc., which are key social determinants of health. A key neoliberal policy approach is deregulation of industries and labor markets, which is presented as necessary to secure private investment, but which harms, for example, workers' health through low quality, precarious jobs, and it destroys life-sustaining environments through extractive activities. Economic and social policy under neoliberalism collude to increase inequality of income and wealth, or the gap between rich and poor, which serves to undermine our democratic institutions and collective agency, speaking to core elements of health like dignity and voice. The political economic system supports all of this by advancing a powerful narrative of individualism, where solutions to complex problems, including health inequities, are packaged in downstream or individualized terms, such as medical care or individual behavior change, which conveniently, but make no mistake, entirely intentionally serves to obscure or distract from the political economic shift that is needed. So in conclusion, if we care about health and health equity, we need a different economic system. It's really as simple as that. The well-being economy offers an alternative option. It will, however, require uncovering and challenging dominant ways of thinking overall, including about health specifically, which currently serve to obstruct change. So with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker, Tony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. You can all hear me okay? So good afternoon, and thank you to David and the members of the Wellbeing Economic Alliance for inviting me to be part of this timely and important conversation. And I'll just begin by telling you a little about who I am and why this subject matters deeply to me. I'm a medical doctor by background. I spent most of my career in public health. I trained originally as a GP, but I quickly came to realise that so much of what was making patients that I saw ill had little to do with the clinical decisions that I could make in the surgery. I could see that the true drivers of health and well-being were upstream, as Lindsay has said, of where I was, in how people lived and the conditions they worked in the security that they had, and in the environments around them and that they lived in. And that's what drew me into public health and eventually led to my appointment as Ireland's Chief Medical Officer, a role that I held, as David has said, for 14 years. And it was during the COVID pandemic, when I had the privilege of leading Ireland's public health response, that this truth became unavoidable to me. The pandemic laid bare for all of us to see just how deeply health is shaped by social and economic conditions, and how vulnerable we all are when those conditions are fragile or unjust. And even though I was working at the apex of a health system with apparent influence and control, it was clear that much of the time and resource of that health system was spent on dealing with the downstream effects of those very fundamental conditions. And since I stepped away from my role as CMO after the emergency phase of the pandemic came to an end, these fundamental beliefs have continued to inform my personal work. I now lead the Centre for One Health at University College Dublin as of last year, an initiative grounded in the understanding that human health, plant health, animal health and environmental health are inextricably linked to each other and linked with economic well-being. And it is that same conviction that has led me to recently join the board of Antashka, which is Ireland's national trust. Actions like protecting the natural environment, advocating for sustainable living and defending the public good are not separate from public health. They are public health. If we want to create a healthy society, we cannot do so without safeguarding the environments, ecosystems and communities that sustain life. During the pandemic, the focus was rightly on the virus itself. Infection rates, ICU beds, testing facilities, contact tracing, vaccines and so on. But it became clear to me very quickly that the true impact of the pandemic, again as Lindsay has said, in terms of who got sick, who died, who suffered, was shaped less by the biology of the virus and more by the conditions in which people lived. Inequality, poverty, precarious work, insecure housing and weak social protections were the real risk factors. When the Irish government and governments all around the world intervened to do things like protecting incomes, freeze evictions, support businesses, strengthen social services, they were making economic decisions which were, in fact, public health measures. The economy was never a separate issue. It was, and it still is, a health issue. It is clear that COVID-19 is one, albeit recent and highly visible expression of a deeper pattern. It exposed a series of deep structural drivers of risk, forces that shape health outcomes everywhere and that connect directly to the kind of economy that we've built. And I'm going to name 4 features. So first of all is the climate emergency. Extreme weather, air pollution, food insecurity, changing patterns of infectious disease, all of these are already driving health crises around the world. They are being driven by an economic model which is based on fossil fuel dependency, endless consumption, a focus on growth that's defined only on the basis of GDP, and the externalization of environmental costs. Second is the destruction of nature and our ecosystems. Things like deforestation, the industrialization of agriculture, the loss of biodiversity, are all driven by economic activity and they increase the risk of pandemics and food system collapse all over the world. We know that when we encroach upon and degrade the natural world, we undermine conditions for human health, and we increase the risk of pathogens spilling over into human populations, just like we saw with SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. The third is inequality. We live in a world where wealth is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, while millions live in poverty or economic insecurity. Today, the richest 1% of the population of the world own nearly half of all global wealth, while over 700 million people live on less than €2 a day. In the European Union, the wealthiest 20% of households earn more than 5 times the income of the poorest 20%. And in Ireland, the top 10% of earners receive almost 30% of total income, while the bottom 10% get just 3%. This inequality is not only unjust, it is making us sick. It is one of the most powerful risk factors for poor health. Inequality drives higher rates of mental illness, poor nutrition, preventable illness, and premature death. Chronic, non-communicable disease like heart disease, cancer, lung disease, and diabetes now account collectively for well in excess of 3/4 of all deaths in the world, with the burden falling disproportionately on those who live in disadvantaged communities and societies. In Ireland, people living in the most deprived areas are 3 times more likely to die from chronic conditions like those I've mentioned than those in most affluent areas. Inequality quite literally, therefore, shortens lives. It drives ill health and it erodes our resilience. It is a product of how we choose to run our economies. And fourthly, the commercialisation of health. So healthcare, food systems, social care and more are increasingly shaped by commercial actors whose interests don't always align with public well-being. We've witnessed the consequences of profit-driven decision-making in pharmaceutical access, food and nutrition, healthcare provision, misinformation, and corporate influence over products that impact our health, as well as our health behaviours. That is why I now argue in everything that I do and when I can, that health is not the byproduct of economic growth, it is the foundation of it. We must therefore see expenditure on health and well-being as an investment and not as a cost. The risks we face today in terms of things like pandemics, chronic disease, mental distress, ecosystem collapse are all symptoms of systemic dysfunctions. Human, plant, animal, environmental and economic well-being are all part of the same system. That's the One Health perspective. It's why I work at UCD, it's why I've joined Antashka, and it's why I believe that those of us as health leaders or in leadership positions have an obligation to speak out not only about healthcare, but about how our economies are designed. So the real question is this: what kind of economy do we want if we want people and the planet to thrive? The pandemic showed us that when we choose to act, we can. We can prioritise the health of women of childbearing age and of young children. We can provide income supports. We can provide access to education, access to opportunity, to housing protections and to universal healthcare. And we can invest in prevention. And we can certainly address inequality. And these are not utopian ideas. Many of these were public health necessities during COVID-19. So we need an economy that prioritises equity, reducing the gap between rich and poor, that protects and restores natural systems, that values care, community and social well-being, not just consumption and profit, and that invests upstream in prevention, resilience and sustainability. In conclusion, during the pandemic, in my position, I often heard the phrase, follow the science. However, experience taught us that science alone was not enough. What shaped outcomes was the economic and social choices that we made or were made for us. The deeper lesson is this: health is political, health is economic, and the kind of economy we build will shape the future of health for people, for communities and for the natural world. If we want to avoid the next crisis, whether it's a pandemic or an environmental catastrophe or the rapidly rising tide of chronic illness, we must change the system. We need to build economies designed not for profit and consumption, but for well-being, sustainability and equity. And that is what One Health means to me. And that is the lesson of the pandemic that we cannot afford to forget. Thank you.
Hello, will I move on or yeah?
Yes, please, Anne-Marie. Thank
you,
you.
Tony. I will go and pull up my.
I was probably supposed to introduce you and segue properly too,
Oh
so
no,
my apologies, Anne-Marie.
no, not at all. Not at all. I was probably there we go. Everybody can see my slides. Yes, good, 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 good. Still like to do the little kind of check. So I am also from, is hopefully you might hear that my accent doesn't sound a million miles away from Tony's because I'm in Northern Ireland, and he was in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, and I work as a GP, a family doctor in Northern Ireland. I wanted to start with this picture. I'm now hiding or maybe, oh, sorry, hiding part of my screen. Am I hiding part of my screen or is that just visible to me? Oh, good, 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 good.
Great.
So this is a picture taken yesterday with my family as we travel through the Mourns. This is about 5 miles from where I am currently sitting now in my house. This is all of my family who live now within 150 meters of where my house is and of where the house that I grew up in, that my mother was in. My brother in the back there in a white shirt. I grew up on a small farm. He still keeps some belted Galloway cows now, which are conservation grazers, and which in next month will be out for the summer on the pasture in those mountains in behind. So this was yesterday. We were there all together because it was a celebration of the two boys that are 11-year-olds who are having their confirmation, and so we were all out together and going on for something to eat afterwards. And so I trained as a family doctor in Northern Ireland, and then I moved to work in Wales, also in the United Kingdom. And I worked as a GP in a deprived area and also as a researcher and an educator, and then in managing health services and then in digital healthcare. And all along that, kept on working as a GP. Then, after more than 20 years, I moved back to Northern Ireland to be closer to these people, my family. I don't have any children. My husband and I don't have any children ourselves, but we wanted to be closer to the young people growing up and to my mother, who was older. And so this was our decision, was grounded in this kind of desire for proximity, continuity of our relationships and being involved deeply in a community. So that's personally where I'm starting. I'll refer back along to some of the ideas and why this is in a way so important. But I want to start with just sort of saying about how, the economy and the kind of like wins that we've had as a world and what we've managed to do and how life expectancy has changed. And in a way, this shows us that we do have actually control over these things. So life expectancy, it increased massively over the last century, and especially really from the 1950s on. The poorer areas of the world now have around the same life expectancy as the richer areas of the world had in about 1950. And that is due to the kind of progress. It comes about in many ways. It was about sanitation, access to clean water, vaccination programs, antibiotics, safer childbirth, the establishment of comprehensive health and welfare systems as well. And those contributed to this longevity during the 20th century. And later on, the advances in medical technologies like cancer care, cardiac problems, treatments, combined with the public health measures like stopping smoking after encouraging people really to start, we managed to help them to stop, extended life further. So we've got biomedical interventions along with broader social investments, better housing, better education, income support, and a commitment and equity to health access. Those are some of the things that have helped us to get to that position. But in recent decades, that trajectory has become less certain. So in the UK, life expectancy gains have stalled, and in some groups and regions, they have been reversed and are actually falling. So the increases in life experiences have also, of course, led to a rising number of years spent living with illness and disability and functional limitation. And those things, that expansion of morbidity, which as a GP, as a family doctor, I'm seeing and working with, it's meant that we need to think more about our sustainability of our current health and social systems and about our collective capacity to support this aging population with increasingly complex needs. Now, you would think that all of that would lead us to become, really recognizing that and becoming more caring, recognizing about supporting people. But of course, we're trapped also in this kind of austerity kind of coming about since 2010, where the policies have led at times to cuts in public health budgets, cuts in social care provision, and in local government services across the United Kingdom and further afield. And these changes have disproportionately affected really poorer and disabled people. This is a picture of a news article from the Guardian last weekend, because the Labour government who've come in United Kingdom, so this is, as it's described elsewhere, the party of Bevan, the person who actually founded the NHS, our universal healthcare system, have introduced changes to the benefit system, which will see many more people dropping down into poverty and children falling into poverty. And there's a lot of discontent, unsurprisingly, about this. This was from a protest last weekend about it. And of course, these kind of developments are not unique to the UK. In the United States, just as hard. I honestly just cannot not comment on these things. That this week, 10,000 staff were dismissed from the Department of Health and Human Services, many of whom who were working in areas such as vaccine development, infectious disease prevention, programs serving marginalised populations. And the media reports describe a queue of people stretching over a mile, turning up to their building with their deactivated security passes, each needing to be individually informed whether or not they still had a job. So that's what our society, in a way, is starting to look and to treat people as working and working nearly in these sectors, and the people who are in the seat of benefits. And we have to scrutinise these trends. They are raising fundamental questions for us about the purpose and scope of our welfare state in the 21st century, the framing of disability and dependency, and the values underpinning our health policy and system reform. Now, next, now this is a term, these terms, economic inactivity, might make people kind of feel very uncomfortable, but this is the language, and I've taken this from a report in Northern Ireland, where I'm back working and living, as I said. And so in Northern Ireland, 1 in 8 of the population, about nearly 12% of the population, are economically inactive because of long-term sickness or disability. That is twice as high as in richer parts of the United Kingdom, for example, London, where maybe 1 in 20 people are. And so this is framed as being, this is where this talk about benefits cuts, whatever, let's get people back to work. But I just put these two charts up from this report because I think it's important, and they help us see how these things are within a wider context. These are not about individual choices. So with regards to gender and economic inactivity, there were, in the 1950s, there were no men economically inactive in Belfast. And there were lots of women, and those women were at home looking after the children. My mother was economically inactive through most of her adult life. She was raising 4 children, and then she looked after her aunt who had raised her because her mother had died in childbirth. and she looked after my aunt until she was 103. But according to the statistics, she would have been economically inactive for all of that time, while she was able to put her time and resources into looking after us. And on top of that, she was also a single mother because my father had died suddenly when I was 14 and my youngest sister was 6. So it feels very unpleasant to talk about, to reduce this to economic inactivity. But if we think about this, like what is it that we're sort of looking at? And even, in this report, it's discussing about how often people who do want to get back into the labour market, they're able to identify the reasons and the barriers for them being able to get back into work. But they're much more complicated to overcome, because rarely are these one-off in nature, single barriers for an individual. You could look and say, well, let's improve people's qualifications. And that's certainly a step that could be taken, but difficult to take without looking at the other challenges, the financial challenges, the health-led challenges, and also access to childcare. So whilst we're in this, and that is the context that we're in, the result is that we will see people in this group where they appear to be disabled and sick because they're not able to participate in this economy, to be active in it in this way. And so then, if we kind of move on, I wanted to talk not about, particularly just because I suppose this is on my mind, is thinking about children and thinking about my nephews yesterday and all of the family and what's going on with them. This picture is of once I came back, I joined the committee as a children's officer. So I'm the voice of the child in a local sporting organisation, which is all the way through Ireland, called the GAA, the Gaelic Athletics Association. And this is in a community centre that's just a few miles or kilometres away from here. And these are little girls who are learning how to play camogie, which is one of the national sports. And they're doing it inside because this is in the winter time, but soon they will be moving outside and doing it playing outside. And in the background, you can see a mural which depicts over the years all the buildings that people in the community have put together and organised and raised. And they've also some of the different the musical organisations and cultural and activity that's been happening in the community. And that's one of the things I love about living here, is being able to come back and participate in this. But the picture for children in general is not good at this time. There is, growing concern about children's well-being in the UK. We know that about 1/3 of 15-year-olds in the UK experience low life satisfaction. They're often physically not so healthy. I was reading a report about a survey done with children in Wales, where less children, and this isn't to do with the pandemic, this was happening before, less children are able to swim, less children are having a healthy diet, less children are getting sleep over the last 10 or 15 years. And one of the biggest things, and there was most change about this across Europe, is actually the ability to be able, one of the things that affects children's happiness, once the top factor is having good and supportive relationships with your family. The next one of the things was actually being able to play outside. And for those of us of a certain age, we grew up being able to play outside, or maybe we didn't have access to those spaces either. But there's been a decline in outdoor play for our children. And a survey, Natural England survey, showed that actually for children living in deprived areas during the pandemic, those children had less access to outdoor play than they did before the pandemic. And that was because of not having access, probably through school. They were getting that access to places to be able to be outside and active, and they don't have that. And those, that's just like one like little microcosm of how do we actually value children and and the lives of people and the spaces and the environment that we actually create for them. Because the other thing that's around this is being people working longer hours, where people are working longer hours, they have less times for working with their families, being with their families. They also will have this organization, the picture here, this is a voluntary organization. I am able to give of my time to go and work in that. But we need, if people have longer working hours, then they have less time even to be contributed to these other social fabric, the activities that create social cohesion in our societies. So if we take it as a marker of broader conditions about the playing outside, is a neighbourhood safe, is there green space, and whether the community is valued and whether the children are treated as a public priority. So my last sort of claim is that and this is why I titled my little segment Health is Justice. The role, Robert Reich is an academic in public policy. And what we have to do is our role as a civil society is about holding the powerful to account. It's about stopping brutality, holding the powerful accountable, and protecting the vulnerable. That is what civil society is about, and it's about what is necessary to have health, and it's about the kind of economy that we should have. So I began with that photo of my family in the Mourne Mountains, our moment of connection and place and shared time. And that for me is what well-being looks like in everyday life. But the task ahead for us is to ensure that these possibilities are not just personal choices, but supported by collective systems, because a society that enables us to live longer must also enable us to live well together.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. That's great. Shall I have the screen now, Amira? Thanks. Hello, everybody. Look, I'll try and be as quick as possible going through this. Because I worked as a mental health doctor, I chose to talk about how the economy impacts mental health. And I'm also very incompetent technically, so I'm getting Amira to do the slides for me. So I'm, as I say, I was a mental health doctor for many years in the NHS. I then, really for the last 20 years, I've in fact worked with NGOs, non-government organizations, and I'm particularly passionate about trying to change the way we deliver health for society, as I mentioned right at the beginning. And really what Anne-Marie was talking about, this whole notion of social justice, for me is a really important aspect of this. So next slide, please. Great. So I'm going to just run through some points about how I think that the economy is really impacting on health. One thing immediately is to talk about the fact that politicians inevitably try and save money because the health system is expensive. I mean, one of the things about the ideas of some of us of wanting to completely transform the health system, it's inefficient. And as it gets better and better at doing certain things, it becomes much more expensive. And the question is, can we afford it? Because this country, like many in Europe, has open access to health, which is a tremendous thing in itself, but it's very costly in the end. So the problem is then, if you try and tackle the thing as if health was an industry of some kind, then you create problems, as Anne-Marie was highlighting in relation to poverty, but also in terms of the quality of the service you get, rationing and so on, it produces real difficulties. And of course, care can't be quantified. And in mental health, there are particular problems about reducing service quality. As a customer, you immediately recognize things aren't as they should be. Teams are very fed up with having to work in a rationed service. And of course, reduced quality means more risk in the end to the public. Next slide, please. Other thing I'm pretty hot on is this notion of shiny toys. The truth is, people talk about innovation and what's the next thing, and whether it's thinking about furniture, your cars, your phone, or your health system, people want new things. And the trouble is, they aren't necessarily better things. However, industries are very keen to do this, to make this happen, because this is how they make money. So we're maintaining large hospitals because there's a lot of industry vested interest in keeping things that way, just as the idea of using lots of toys. I mean, it seems daft to talk about an MRI scanner as a toy, but the truth is they are all clever machines. And the question is whether we really need them as much as we're being told we do. And I'm particularly worried about health apps, for example, in regard to mental health, because I think that, again, they're being used as a tool really to justify rationing by saying this is a much cleverer and easier way of doing things, of course, much cheaper. But the truth is, particularly mental health, is a staff-intensive setup, which requires people to know what they're doing, to interact directly with the person, and provide scientifically proven treatments. The other thing really is about a shift towards more technical approaches to mental health. Is they're fundamentally dehumanizing, because first of all, the normal face-to-face type of human interaction with all the sorry about that. Thought I switched it off. With all the non-verbal communication and so on, half of it disappears when you're on a screen. But also the whole notion of being hyper-technical, which you see in some parts of health, is that it shifts attention away from human interactions. And of course, in mental health, that's a disaster. Next slide, please. So I'm very conscious that I'm throwing all this written stuff at you. As I say, you can read it afterwards anyway. So I thought I'd just introduce a picture just to try and cheer you up a bit. But let's go on to the next slide. One of the other players, apart from health tech, is the pharmaceutical industries. Now, these are very powerful, large conglomerates who have lobbying power because they play the card of economic growth. It's the nature of the model that we're using. And because they're very profitable and then they're seen as a good thing, and certainly have leverage in policy. But of course, they can misuse that power, such as, for example, overcharging in a way that is very difficult to deal with because of patents often. But the fact is that they also present a risk, because the way things are going, someone talked about, Lindsay talked about neoliberal policy. I think there's another thing really, which is about simply how profit has accelerated in terms of its importance for people who are concentrating on wealth, so that more and more companies are not willing to take risks, but simply maximize profit. And that can mean, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, that research and producing new products, which is actually very risky for them, of course, I remember very well a really fantastic antidepressant when I was working in the field suddenly had to be pulled because quite unexpectedly, it was nobody's fault. They discovered a rare and dangerous side effect for just a handful of people, but they had to withdraw the drug, and that represented millions of investment. So there is a problem here. But the other problem with pharma is that they promote, of course, a biomedical model of mental distress, because antidepressants and things that treat anxiety are something that's easy to dispense, but actually it's often can be a kind of simply a short-term solution. It's sticking plaster in a way, because what's not being looked at often is the social determinants of mental distress. And that's what I want to finish with. So next slide. So this is a real point. It's already been made in a way that when you talk about an epidemic of mental illness, I would argue it's not at all that. But it's actually, it's not people who are getting sicker, it's society that's become sick. And that the arguments there are much more about social ones, about people not being able to adjust to this incredibly rapid change in technology and the way people respond. You know, I used to show a slide of people reading the newspapers on a tube, and only a few years later, everyone was simply on their phone. And the question is, this has psychological impact on people, all of us. So people are worried about kids on screens, and I know only two of my grandchildren on their phones or on their screens or whatever. But what I would argue is it's much more sinister than that, because underneath that is how it's affecting society, which is the fragmentation of social networks. People don't talk to each other and relate in the same way because of the technology. And what's also been raised is that the economy pushes people towards self-centeredness. It's linked to this idealization of materialism and wealth. So last slide. And really, the truth is, we are, whether you're educated or you're totally uneducated, as a human being, you sense that things aren't right. It's part of our survival mechanism. But the trouble is, if we don't know why this is happening, simply we find ways of dealing with that existential anxiety by defense mechanisms, rationalizing it, or simply denying what's going on. And for me, this is part of the reason why I think it's so important to talk about a transformational system. We have to change the way we live, change our values, and this is a huge thing. But nevertheless, whether it's the health ecosystem or the economic one, for me, this is essential for us to live a decent life. So my last slide is simply this one, which I've used many times, in fact, but it is a huge task, but nevertheless, to me, it's vital. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. I'm just going to get my slides up. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, looks great, Kathrin.
Perfect, thank you. Right, that's quite something to follow. Right, so my name is Kathrin. I'm a early career researcher, so I'm a Liver Hume Early Career Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. And in the broader context of the panel, it's quite important to note that I am a researcher and have kind of, that's where I've spent my career so far. So my experience is necessarily more limited than that of other panelists, but I'm hoping that I can add a slightly different perspective. So my work to date has focused mostly on corporate power and specifically on corporate influence on policymaking. And most of that has been on food, and I have a really specific interest as well in decision-making processes and how that shapes, who can exert power and, who can actually influence decisions. So it's I'm not at home in the wellbeing economy space, but it's a really interesting it's an interesting concept that I've come across a lot. And myself and others working on corporate power and corporate influence, I think a lot of us keep running into the kind of broader discussions around economies more broadly, because we keep coming up against the challenge that it's so limited what we can do within health or within food policy, because so much comes down to those wider structures. So what I'm doing today is kind of drawing on my work and that of my colleagues on corporate influence and corporate power in food policy as an example. I think a lot of this applies much more broadly, as David's talk illustrated quite well, and kind of to bring in the wellbeing economy idea and seeing how how that relates and how that can potentially provide some solutions to challenges we are experiencing. There we go. Right, so as I'm sure most of you are aware, the way we produce and consume food is really deeply connected with our environment and health. And the food system that we have at the moment goes some way towards feeding us, at least in the global north, but it doesn't really sustain people's health, and it comes with major impacts on our environment, as Tony illustrated really well. And a lot of these impacts are also really inequitable. So what we have is that, essentially for way too many of us, healthy, nourishing and sustainable food is really not accessible and not affordable enough. So what we need to kind of solve that is a really systemic shift, and some really great thinking going on around this, and there's some really interesting things that the wellbeing economy concept can offer here as well. What I'm focusing on here in my talk today is the kind of regulation, the more specific regulations that we have to reshape our food environment. So it's very much about prevention. It's about kind of creating an environment that makes it easier to be healthy. Think, for example, sugar, sweetened beverage taxes, or, marketing restrictions, for example. And so there's some of the tools in, it's really important to note that they're no silver bullets, and they're just some of the tools in the toolbox that we have, to kind of work towards that shift. But what I found really striking is that essentially even some of those really common sense policies, like restricting advertising to children, for example, for the least healthy foods, they're really, really hard to get through. And one of the main reasons for this, and one of the really important reasons for this, is essentially the power that a shrinking number of companies hold in our food system and the way they use that power. So that brings me to the theme of corporate power. So as I mentioned, we have an increasingly concentrated food sector globally, and I think, so this is a really nice graphic by IPES Food that's at a global level, and it kind of shows how different parts of our food system are essentially dominated by a small number of firms, and that will look differently by region and by country, but essentially this is a trend we've been experiencing over the past decades. And when we're talking about market concentration and market power, the thing that is really relevant when we're talking about politics and kind of policy making is that the dominant firms also wield a lot of political power. So their market dominance essentially puts firms in a position where they can shape markets, they can shape technology and innovation agendas, but really importantly, they can also shape policy and governance in a way that smaller firms and particularly most other actors in society can't. And that's an example I really like to come back to. This is a leaked document from Coca-Cola Europe from about 2016, where they mapped a range of policies that were, somewhat on the table based on business impact and likelihood to materialize. And you can see in the top right corner where they've highlighted policies to fight back against. And at the top there is new and increased product taxes in member states. And also if you're familiar with food policy at all, if you look kind of across the matrix more broadly, this is really what's happened. So, the fight against sugar sweetened beverage taxes, we do have a lot of them now at national level, but they've been really, really hard to get through. And the fight, particularly, Coca-Cola has kept coming up in our research that we've done around this topic. They have really fought this really hard, and some of the policies are starting to shift into being more likely to materialize, and we're seeing heavy pushback here. And this is something that a lot of smaller firms would not be in a position to do. And again, this makes this is in line with the purpose of a company like Coca-Cola. So it's not like there's not much to do with companies being evil in any way. This makes business sense for them. So I'm not going to go into detail on the ways in which companies do influence food policy, but essentially it's just really important to know that commercial influence is a really important barrier to policy action. It's not all companies, but it happens really consistently, and we do see that in our research that any regulation, is really, does face a lot of pushback, and this happens, through different pathways, like legal strategies. We see, for example, soda taxes have had some pushback, some legal challenges that essentially go back to competition law, where basically soda taxes get positioned as anti-competitive. We see direct involvement in the direct lobbying of decision makers. We see influence on science and evidence, etc. Again, I'm not going into detail here, but what's really important to highlight in the context of this, this session today, is that economic arguments are really, really central to the opposition, and they're really powerful. So we keep hearing from decision makers that we interview in our research across different settings, across global level, national level, I think, and particularly that's, again, European context primarily, that those arguments are really powerful because they really spook people. And, the threat of kind of impact on growth, impact on business revenue really does work. And that's why we do keep seeing it. And in that context, it's important to note that that does not happen in a vacuum. So those arguments are really powerful because, the economic impacts and outcomes are really central to decision-making, to a lot of decision-making processes. So, think about economic impact assessments that are required in a lot of settings. We're a lot better at evidencing economic impacts than we are at evidencing health and well-being impacts, for example. And again, I know that's really hard to measure and quantify, but the enforcement of those kind of assessment processes of assessing, business and economic impacts is a lot better. It's done a lot more consistently. And that kind of, and the centrality of kind of having to make policy that, doesn't harm the economy and doesn't harm businesses really empowers those economic actors, and it disempowers others. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind, that this doesn't, this is not just the companies are able to draw on those kind of broader structural conditions. And again, kind of coming back to what Lindsay said earlier, the kind of neoliberal ideology and kind of individualism provides a really fertile ground for arguments that kind of say, oh, we could just, do education of individuals. We could just do like voluntary measures and kind of and partnership approaches instead of regulating. This is kind of this promise of acting without disrupting business and without requiring government intervention. That's really appealing, but it's really not worked very well. So it's really important to note that broader context. And then, sorry, I'm running out of time. Yeah. In terms of looking ahead, and I thought also in terms of things that we could pick up in the discussion, because again, as I said, I'm not at home in the wellbeing economy space, but I think the idea of a wellbeing economy is really compelling and potentially has a lot of sway, has the potential to really reorient power structures in decision making. I think thinking particularly about kind of how we make policy, I think by changing what we value and also what we measure, it can really shift power away from those that are currently really, really powerful and overrepresented in decision making. And I know it's not a magic fix, but I think there's something really interesting about translating those principles into decision making. One interesting example I've come across, for example, is the Australian Capital Territory. They've introduced a wellbeing impact assessment requirement, which I think is really, and again, I don't know how well that's working in practice, but I think it sounds like a really, that's a really interesting idea, for example. So, yeah. And then finally, also, Jennifer Clapp, the scholar, makes this point a lot better than I do. But essentially, coming back to the issue of corporate concentration, really impacting our policy space, it's really important to tackle corporate concentration alongside, broader food system shifts. But we can't do this as long as we have a really, really heavily concentrated sector, essentially. And again, that applies beyond food. Right, that's me done. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Kathrin. It's very compelling, the arguments you make. Right now, we are going to invite the panelists to come together, really, to talk about how they react to each other's presentations, but also to think, it's an excellent start, actually, for us, Kathrin, by talking about the future, because that's really... This is, remember, part of the strapline for this, which is, so what do we do about it? we can see the potential evils, whatever the benefits are of the growth economy. But the question is, so what? What can we do as it's so easy to feel helpless, isn't it, in these circumstances? So you've already made a start by suggesting some things. Granted, it's in relation to the food sector, but you can see how it can apply elsewhere as well. So I'd invite Anne-Marie, Lindsay, Tony, to maybe just comment. Who'd like to? Perhaps we use a hand up type of mechanism just to see who wants to speak. Yeah. No one wants to get started. There, Lindsay.
Sure, I'll start. First of all, thanks so much to my co-presenter colleagues on the panel today. I really enjoyed all of these very thought-provoking presentations. Just a couple of things come to mind for me. So one is, I think, a thread that we heard across several of the presentations around disrupting power, holding power to account, etc. And there's a very nice, I think, alignment with that and the upstream concept, which was another thread across the presentation. So it just strikes me that there's a really important opportunity to kind of connect and strengthen the intersection of those comments, and developing the courage and the clarity to be able to do that in the health sector, which we currently do not do very well at all. In fact, we currently shy away from engaging with power and politics. So I'll just offer that. Thank you.
Tony, you got your hand up.
Just two brief points. There's probably far less that we disagree on than we agree on. There's quite a common thread running through much of the presentations, and we're all coming from the same place. And I'm going to venture to guess that many of the people in your audience probably have similar views. And so the question becomes how we turn this into some form of action. And when we frame the issue as broadly as we are, it can sometimes make it feel sort of disempowering. The idea of it's so big and it's so complicated, what can we possibly do? I think we have to find ways of introducing the idea that our responsibility as individuals relates to the things that are within our own individual sphere of influence, however small or great that might be, and to give people that kind of sense of agency around the kinds of things that we can do. And the other thing I was just going to say, in not unrelated, but in response to what Kathrin was saying, so much of what she's talking about the activities of those who are, let's say, involved in the commercial industry that determine an impact on health. They learn from each other. They invest in the practices that they do. And we don't do either of those two things in health. I mean, we don't really invest in those activities, and we don't find ways of learning from one another. And I think just the last point I'll make in relation to that is that that the phrase commercial determinants of could be applied to things like biodiversity loss and climate change just as much as it is to health and well-being. And that learning frame, I think, should be framed in that way, that we need to get much better at having those conversations across these sectors and silos that industry has figured out how to do a long, long time ago.
Oh, that's very interesting, Tony. It is about action, isn't it? And what's the most constructive means of challenging the status quo? But Anne-Marie, you made a comment in the chat. Do you want to actually?
It's quite interesting because somebody's picked up. I feel like I've sounded a bit more, well, slightly more militant, but not in some ways. And because I'll highlight it. Somebody said, they say cut back, we say fight back at WEAll. We focus more on building more hopeful and viable alternatives. It feels like it is time to fight back, and that's the same. I was called up in the chat there about using that Robert Wright quote, which is actually from an article where he's talking about we need to stand up to bullies like Putin and Trump. This is just where it's at. We just need to call these things out. And if we if we start and we say, so the thing that was being said was this language of saying the vulnerable, we better to say people living with vulnerability. But sometimes we need to keep our language so clearly focused in a way of this, like nearly like a slogan. And I don't know how do people feel about that, about coming up with clear messages versus is this the way? How can we and I absolutely believe in an an assets-based approach. I grew up in a place where I respect the assets, and I was describing that there are lots of reasons that within my family it could have been seen as a very vulnerable family, a single mother. My father, even when he was alive, was often not in work, but he was not in work because of having an epilepsy as a child and limits in families about going on, but contributed massively to his community and was involved in setting up all of these organizations, which I'm now able to continue on sort of doing. So I think I can completely sort of get this, but I think we're at this time where maybe we need to be really clear about what we're talking about and not be minimal with our words.
Fair enough. Now I'm going to break the rule here, as we've got limited time in terms of Q&As as well as the discussion. I see my old colleague Alish has got his hand up, colleague from the Czech Republic. Perhaps we'll invite Alish to make a comment, then I'll follow up what's been said at the moment. So Alish.
Thank you, David. Very briefly, I agree about the action, and I find a parallel between the fashion industry and the situation we're in. People have lost the ability to understand the elegant, and elegance is usually in chastity and simplicity. It's not putting everything that you have in the cupboard on yourself. And at this point, I think that we need to find a mean how to convince people to take up the elegant rather than taking the flashy, trendy, and glamorous, which has been imposed to them by the various channels that have been discussed in the discussion.
Yes, living this.
That's all I wanted to say. Thank you, David.
No, Alice, it's a fair point, but it is about us. A dramatic change in values, and yet at the same time, I always go on about, because I'm an old man, I keep going on about things. But is look to children, and the truth is we're born with innate attitudes, which then get unfortunately socialized out of us. That kids can recognize things, and it's why student movements are often so powerful as well. But the theme really, I suppose I'm getting to, is that question of narrative. I do think that it's crucial for, and I think it's well recognized by the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, that narratives are vital in terms of persuading people to think differently and to challenge the prevailing really, we're being brainwashed, by these very powerful organizations who are very clever at doing it, persuading us that black is white and so on. We know one of the things that dictatorships do, and we see it happening currently in the world, is take charge of the communications to make sure that people only think in one way rather than looking at diverse things. But that's just my reflection. Who else would like to comment? We've got a good 5, 6, 7 minutes left for people to join in. Valeria, sorry. Valeria is one of our group, and please do contribute.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really interesting conversation. It's really great to bring the conversation to more people. So really excited. Got me thinking around a lot of things. Just wanted to build on the conversation we're having around language, just to second what David was saying, that we were thinking about narrative and, trying to use those spaces of collective thinking, intelligence to understand what could be an alternative narrative to help transform the health and the economy, so it's in the service of health, right? And I wanted to point out that I like what's emerging a bit around the use of asset framing, because we were looking more at societal level, but here it's really also individual level and links both, and adds the lens that asset framing has an impact that has been recognized. So asset framing is like, I was using in the chat the example of, like, for example, Black at-risk youth group reframed as students. You know, there's a really radical approach, moving away from like looking at a group from a space of scarcity and limit and so on, and looking at them from a space of like the potential that they represent. And this has an impact both on the people who define rules of systems and so on, you know, because they look differently at the population. When they're looking at the Black people, they're thinking, okay, those are people who are going to end up in jail, they need rescuing, whatever. But also on the population themselves, because we internalize all our life what is told to us. So it's being demonstrated that these young kids, they actually believe that there's a straight road between them and jail, right? So when you reframe it as students, and then they start internalizing this new discourse, they can also see a potential in themselves, which also is a very great activator in creating the change that we want to see, right? Because at the end of the day, we were mentioning fighting back. We can only really fight back by bringing with us the people who are the most impacted by the state of our system, and that works only when those people believe and what is it that we wanted to have them see, right? So I just wanted to say that it is, I think, something really important and really challenging, because like it's radical and it means like probably playing between two sets of languages, right? Like translating little bit by little, like, you know, with the people with disability, vulnerability, to make it also understood, but at the same time tagging, you know, like this message of there are more than that. I live with migraine. Initially, I was told like I'm a migraine sufferer. Myself, I live with migraine. I know that it's a very debilitating disease. Call me disabled. I won't like that at all. I don't consider myself disabled at all. You know, I feel like I'm really empowered and so on. So there's really something with identity and language and so on. At the same time, I want people to understand what migraine is, because society needs to change, the policy needs to change, right? So language is really, really important.
Thanks for that. So I'm looking at the clock. I'm afraid you always have to do that. But I'd invite a couple more comments, and then Lindsay and I'll try and sum up.
We've got some really good reflections in the chat, so we could even go to those potentially, if you'd like to read them aloud, because there's some really nice points.
Yes, I wonder, perhaps Marguerite is, in a way, has been a godparent to this group. I wonder if you'd like to just comment.
I'm multitasking, so I'm doing the care economy. I've got my two boys sitting here next to me, which is why I've got the video off from time to time. So sorry for the background noise. But yeah, no, I just want to thank you, first of all, for this session. It's been so inspiring, and it's so great to have all these different, sort of perspectives and really bring this together. I found it hugely inspiring to also for us to be able to talk about health and the well-being economy. It's one of the requests that we get most often. And so I found it really, valuable in sort of also learning to speak about those connections. No easy solutions, I don't think, for any of this. So we're constantly trying to find examples from around the world of where we're seeing positive change and trying to bring that together. But yeah, I mainly just want to thank you for all of these insights and for the session. It's been really, really fantastic.
Thanks very much, Marguerite, and I appreciate you multitasking. We all have a life outside as well. So what Marguerite said, actually, of course, is inviting Lindsay to join me now, really, in reflecting on what we've heard. There's always, I think, there's always the problem, the worry about being in an echo chamber where everyone agrees about something, and that's all very well, but it's not the way to change the world, is it? But it's a question of really using the power of those agreements to make a difference, and that means, I guess, spreading the word, isn't it, as much as possible. But I did think that Marguerite's point at the end, of course, is something we kind of hinted at in terms of what the next webinars are going to be about. They are indeed about looking at where maybe there are some sorts of answers are coming out from this. You know, it's about eating the elephant, I always say, you know, isn't it? You just do a little bit at a time, but it is actually perhaps the only way to deal with such a huge thing, really. But Lindsay, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you. I guess a couple of things in addition to what I've already said. One, I wanted to pick up on Alish's comment, as well as David, something that you talked about on your shiny things slide.
Mm-hmm.
This is something I've been thinking about. You know, people like to have nice things, like they want to have nice stuff. And I think that's something we need to contend with in this space, because we're not actually trying to take that away. We're almost thinking of a different type of abundance, right? So the version of abundance we have right now with the narrow economic growth model is only one version of abundance, and there's tons of waste and harms that come with it. So I think a key piece for our narrative work is around what abundance looks like in a well-being economy, and how it's just so much better. Like, it's so much better. So that's one point. Maybe I see Alish has his hand up, so I'll pause here and let him come in on that before I go to my closing remarks.
Oh, very quickly, it's going to be politically incorrect, but the only way how to sell things is to turn it into addiction. It has to do something with the dopamine receptors of the audience, and it's used by the opponents, and I think it's quite legitimate to use it on this side of the front too. That's my personal idea.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alish. I have to say, my particular one of the axes I have to grind is the question of how two-dimensional a society that thrives on materialism and individualism is. What we're losing there is the world we live in is being connected. I mean, I'm a bit of a cynic, you know, when people talk about mindfulness, for example, that there's a sense in which it's right in a way, but it can just become another gimmick, really, rather than the principle behind it, which is recognizing all the aspects of the world that matter. And that means not just the external world, it is about having time for reflection, you know, caring about others, things which actually get lost in that two-dimensional world. But of course, Tony stressed the point about the interconnectedness of things. It's so easy to lose that if you're on a treadmill just wanting to have better things, you know, rather than you're then losing what you've already got, but you can't see it, you know, because you're so preoccupied with other things. Now, that's a kind of sounds very wishy-washy, but in living it, I think it's a crucial part of having a good life. And I mean, that I think even the ancients understood that. You know, wasn't it Aristotle who talked about a good life? And that meant, in a way, caring about other people, doing stuff that matters, not just individualistic, but it's just a thought. Sorry, there's lots of other messages coming in. I just want to see whether we can acknowledge those. But Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I did quickly just want to make sure we acknowledged all of the other working group members who have been on this call. So Valeria Duflo, who we've heard some excellent comments from, Lise Mitchell Noble, and Andy Turner. So thanks very much to all of you. Maybe just to end on a optimistic note, there are signs that we can do this. So Anne-Marie talked about the welfare state in the post-war World War II period. Tony talked about the pandemic, and both of those have given glimpses of how, you know, our societies and our structures can be mobilized for good. We have proof that this can happen. Now neither of those were perfect. So for example, the welfare state in Canada was basically based on a model of white citizenship, and that is a very important thing that we need to reckon with. But if we cannot dismiss the important messages that come from those initiatives, and I sometimes talk about needing a welfare state 2.0. I need a better name for it, but I think it's essentially a well-being economy, and we need to get behind that. If I may, I would actually like to close my comments at least by quoting a member of our working group, Andy Turner, who's also an awesome public health person in the UK. And this is actually something that Andy has written that I've used in my teaching because it's awesome. So Andy says, our current economy is the cause of so many of our problems, but a well-being economy can be the solution. While progress may often be frustratingly slow, the world is heading in the right direction. There are just too many good people and too many good ideas out there for it not to. So thank you, Andy.
Yes, I like that. Well, again, it's like me talking about small children. I mean, there is always hope. So that although we've been talking about damage caused by the economy, human beings are still human beings, and human values will survive. The problem is, at the moment, human values are being challenged very severely in many parts of the world. But I like Valeria's comment just turned up, the arc of history bends towards justice. I think we have to believe, don't we? I think that's the most important thing. It's what sustains us. Look, anyway, before we get too sentimental about things, thank you, all the contributors. And we look forward to meeting some of our audience, at least, next time we put on a webinar, and we'll indeed explore some of the examples that, for example, Marguerite mentioned in the chat. And we'll see what we don't yet know how we're going to do this, but in the next couple of months, we'll sort it out. And thanks again to our silent partner, Amira, who's there watching and making sure we all behave ourselves. She's contributed a lot to this event happening. So thanks very much, everyone. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
David.
you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.